Alrighty, hello everybody. Thanks for joining us for today's cybersecurity seminar number 1. We'll be having John Ford run us through some of the introductory stuff to cybersecurity. So hopefully for those of you that are beginners, this is a good way to get introduced to the topic and then find out different ways that you can get more knowledge in cybersecurity. Right now on the screen, I've got a sign-in QR code. I'll post that again in the chat in case people jumped in. So if you're on Suitable, not everybody is, but if you're on Suitable, which is the basically the new Hawk link, you can sign into that and then get I don't know if it's credit or whatever it is for attending today's cybersecurity meeting. So I'll go ahead and jump it on over to John, and John will go ahead and get us started.
All righty, hello. Give me a second so I can share my screen. So my name is John Ford, and I'm doing red team stuff for CyberHawks. But today I'll just be doing an overview of cybersecurity topics because I feel like cybersecurity is something that you can learn on your own, and a lot of people do. But the difficulty is finding the right terminology for things and understanding what's out there and what there even is to learn. So that's what I'm going to be going over here. Very briefly, before I start, I'm going to have to go over some networking concepts. I apologize if some of you already know this stuff and to you it's boring, but we will get into actual cybersecurity stuff in a moment. Quick high-level overview before I do that. In terms of cybersecurity, and those of you who also attended the Project Day presentation last Wednesday or whenever it was, some of this will be review because I did talk about social engineering a lot in that, but I'll talk more about the pen testing side too and some of the defensive stuff. So in terms of cybersecurity, what is there? There's offense and there's defense. I'll write that. When it comes to offense, there are kind of two main categories. There's penetration testing, also known as pen testing for short. And there is social engineering. When it comes to defense, there's hardening, monitoring or real-time defense, and antivirus. Or at least that's how I like to categorize the defense. Now, before I actually get into what all these crazy terms that I threw at you mean, let's do a little overview of networking so that you at least have an understanding of that. So first of all, everything in computers is done in binary, which you probably know. The reason is because hardware is, you can do things with on and off. So for high voltage, low voltage. And binary is basically a numerical system where each digit has two options, so a 0 or a 1. And therefore, because each digit has two options, it's known as base 2. Of course, you can convert binary to decimal, which is what we normally use. You know, digits go from 0 through 9. And that's known as 0 through 9. That's known as base 10, right? There's also what you'll encounter a lot if you're doing any sort of development is hexadecimal, which is 0 through each digit has 16 possibilities. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then we use A through F for the rest of them. So A is like the equivalent of 10, B is 11, C is 12, D is 13, so on and so forth. So that's known as base 16. So the reason we use this a lot when it comes to development or cybersecurity is because it's really easy to convert from binary, which is machine understandable code, to hex. Because if you're converting from binary to decimal, which I won't get into right now, you have to actually, if you have a really long binary number, you have to work with the entire binary number. However, if you're converting from binary to hex, because 16 is a multiple of 2, you can take 4 binary digits and really quickly convert them to a hexadecimal digit, no matter how long the binary number is. So that's why a lot of the times you'll see things in hex. And I'm kind of starting with that because I'll be showing you MAC addresses in a second, and those are usually written in hex. And now I'm kind of explaining why they're written in hex. So every device, and when I say device, I mean computer, phone, server, anything that's a machine, has its own hardware physical address. Hardware physical address, sometimes you'll also hear that called the media access control address or the MAC address. This is a unique identifier for every single device. Now, the first few digits of the MAC address is always, well, it's usually written in hex because that's an easy way to read it. And it's usually either colon or dash separated. I'm just writing a random example here. Something like that. Now, the first few digits are always going to be based on the manufacturer, and then the rest of them are variable. Now, ideally, every device in existence has a different MAC address so that you can use it to identify that specific device. So that's how we differentiate devices from each other. Now, let's connect some devices to a network. So how do devices communicate with each other on a network? Well, they do it through something called a router or a switch, but usually a router. So a router, I'm using this red here to represent a router. A router facilitates communication between multiple devices. And devices that are able to communicate with each other comprise a network. So a network is a group of devices that can communicate with each other, usually through a router or some other device like that. Now, let's see. In order to communicate between each other, computers have to have a standardized way of exchanging messages, right? Because in these wires, they can exchange binary data, so like a bunch of zeros and ones, but this computer has to be able to understand what this computer wants from it and vice versa. So in order to do that, they use what are called protocols. And just like even outside of a security context, a protocol means a standardized way of doing something. So when we talk about protocols in a security or networking context, it's a standardized way of communicating between computers. So one of the most common ones is Internet Protocol. Now notice that I just drew here a little network because all these devices are connected through the same router. But of course, this network can be connected to other networks and can communicate between networks. That's known as the internet, between networks. And that's where the word internet comes from. And so the Internet Protocol is a standardized protocol for computers to communicate with each other in the same network and between networks. Now within the Internet Protocol, it can be divided into two classes: Transmission Control Protocol, TCP, or User Datagram Protocol, UDP. Now, Transmission Control Protocol is for when, let's say, you want to send messages very reliably. Like if you're accessing a web page, if so much as 1 bit of the data is wrong, it messes up a character and your web page could look totally different. So it has to be transmitted correctly. So we'll say TCP is reliable. However, in order to do this, it adds additional data, like additional bits for error correction. And because it has to transmit those, that makes it a little slower. UDP is used when we don't necessarily have to be quite as reliable. So I'll just write unreliable, but it's still somewhat reliable, but it's just not quite as reliable. But it's faster because we don't transmit all that extra data to ensure that what we transmitted is accurate. And where would we use UDP? Like for example, in gaming, when you want to move around in a game and you're playing a multiplayer game, you want that change to be reflected on everybody's computer almost instantaneously. You can't wait for it to, you can't like move 2 seconds after you press the arrow keys. So that's where UDP is used. And so some common things, HTTP. So these are TCP and UDP are subsections of IP, or Internet Protocol. And then within that, within TCP, we have HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, that's used for web pages. We have a secured version of that that's encrypted called HTTPS. We have SSH, which is used for command line communication, which we'll talk about in a second. FTP for transferring files, and a bunch of other ones. So I won't really get into that too much, but essentially know that we have IP, Internet Protocol. So in order to identify computers, like let's say, and I should mention that this protocol organizes the data that's being sent into segments called packets. So it sends a certain amount of data at a time, and these little things called packets, and each of these packets have some standardized headers that tell you like where the message is coming from, where the message is going to, what kind of message it is, and other information like that. So in order to differentiate between, or I should mention, first of all, when these computers are connected to a network, or devices, I should say, they don't have to be computers. When they're connected to a network, they're known as hosts. So anything that's on a network is a host on that network. So if somebody asks you how many hosts are on a specific network, they're asking how many devices are connected to that network. I should also mention that earlier I defined network to be a place where multiple computers can communicate, or multiple devices can communicate between each other. Note that one router does not necessarily indicate one network. You can create multiple networks on one router. You can also communicate, so one router can have multiple networks where computers can communicate between each other. You can also communicate between networks too, by routing, that's why it's called a router, by routing traffic from one network to another network. So if this is all new to you, I apologize for going through that very quickly. Now, let's see, what's next? So how do we differentiate between different hosts or devices on a network? Well, we assign them an IP address or Internet Protocol address. Now you'll usually see them like 10.10 or 10.0.0.1 or something like that, or 192.168.1. something, I don't know. So IP addresses allow us to, first of all, segment, to create different sub-networks within a network, and also to differentiate between devices on a network. So each IP address you'll sometimes see it written with a slash, or you'll sometimes see something like this written by it. This is a network mask. So this tells you how many bits in this IP address, and I'm going to dumb it down, so I'm not going to really explain this in depth, but how many bits in this address correspond to the network. And then the rest of them, so in this case, the first 24 bits would correspond to the network. And then the rest of them correspond to the specific device on the network. So if this confuses you, ignore it. But the interesting thing about this is the more bits, or the less bits you use for the network, the fewer networks you can have, but the more devices you can have on each network. Conversely, if you use a lot of bits for the network, you can have many more networks, but fewer devices on that network. But if that confuses you, don't worry about it too much. Essentially, what you need to know is IP addresses are used to distinguish between devices on a network. Now, IP addresses are usually assigned by the router or whatever is facilitating the network communication. There are two ways of assigning IP addresses. There's static assignment and dynamic assignment. So static in general just means fixed, I guess, would be another way of saying it. So a static IP address is, well, let's say we'll just assign this one some number, 192.168.1.7. And that never changes. However, if you have hundreds and hundreds of machines on the same network, you don't want to go in and manually assign them all static IP addresses because that would take a ridiculous amount of time. So there's something called Dhcp, which is, I believe it stands for, don't quote me on this, but I believe it stands for Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. And what that does is it dynamically assigns IP addresses. So when you connect to a router, it'll give you a random IP address that is not currently in use. And then that also allows for recycling them. For example, if somebody hasn't connected to a network for a really long time, then you probably don't need to give them that same IP address anymore, so you can recycle it and give it to somebody else. Anyway, I know I'm going a little bit in depth here, but just want to whet your appetite for some of this stuff. So we have these IP addresses that tell us which computer is which. And when you connect to a network, there's something called ARP, or Address Resolution Protocol. And what that does is it maps IP addresses to hardware physical addresses, or MAC addresses, as I talked about before. Now remember, MAC addresses are unique to every single machine. And IP addresses are assigned at the time that the computer is connected to the network. So then by doing this, if let's say you want to access a machine with a very specific IP and you want to connect to it, it will translate that to the machine's MAC address and then contact that specific machine at its MAC address. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. All right. So now we know how to differentiate between computers on a network using this IP address, which is then translated into MAC addresses. So, and we know that we have standardized protocols like TCP and UDP that allow us to exchange data in a way that every computer understands. But we usually have multiple services running on a computer. And we want to be able to make different types of connections to a computer at the same time. For example, if we want to transfer files, we'll use FTP. But if we want to transfer, if we want to gain access to web pages, we can use HTTP. But let's say we want a server that provides both file transfers and access to web pages. So how do we differentiate between those? Well, in addition, everything is divided into port numbers. So these are just numbers that specify kind of what type of protocol you're using. So they range from 1 to 65535. Now there are some standardized ports that are used for commonly for specific protocols. I mean, it doesn't really matter what port you use for what specific protocol, but some of the standards are like 80 for HTTP, or 443 for HTTPS, or 22 for SSH, and 21 for FTP. So there are some standardizations that, because most people agree with this because it's standardized, it's really easy to make these sorts of communications and know which port to access. All right, so in terms of network communication, I'm almost done here, but we're getting to the meaty, or the most fun part of this explanation. When two computers communicate between each other, one always acts as the server and the other acts as the client. I like to designate server by drawing these little things around it, because I'll explain to you what a server does in a second. Now, this is not to be confused with, server can mean multiple things. Server can mean the machine, a server, that is usually like a computer, but it generally has higher specifications than a computer, so more RAM or more processing power, stuff like that. But I'm not talking about that kind of server. I'm talking about a server versus a client and server-client communication. So the server will open itself for incoming connections. So it'll basically say, hey, I'm ready for anybody who wants to connect to me. And the client will come in and say, hey, I want to connect to you. And then a connection will be established. And from there, they can exchange messages back and forth. Now, let's say you're an attacker and you wanted to gain access to somebody's computer. Well, how are you going to go about doing that? Somehow you have to establish, assuming you're a remote attacker, somehow you have to establish a connection to their computer. And to establish a connection to somebody's computer or device, I keep saying computer, but when I say computer, I mean any kind of device, you need a client and a server. So there are two ways of going about doing it. There's a bind shell. Where your target opens itself up for listening connections, and then you, as an attacker, connect to the target. There's also a reverse shell. Where you as the attacker open yourself up for listening connections, for incoming connections, and then the target connects back to you. So two kinds of shells, bind shell and reverse shell. All right. I should also talk about, that kind of brings me into what are shells? Well, a shell, also known as, is any sort of, I'd say any sort of command-based communication with a computer. So usually you will write a command, and then the computer will spit information back at you, all text-related information. Now, everything on the lowest level with the computer, well, obviously everything on the lowest level is binary, but on the lowest level, it's just you inputting commands and the device spitting information back at you. And then all the nice graphical stuff that you see, that's just stuff added on top to make it nice for the user. But as long as you can gain access to that command line, you have full access over the computer. So I'll use the words shell and command line interchangeably. Now in Linux and in Mac, this is called a terminal. The terminal is what you use to gain that shell or to communicate those commands to the computer and gain the responses. And in Windows, it's called the command prompt. All right. I should also quickly mention, because I did talk about the difference between TCP and UDP. I talked about how TCP is slower but more reliable. When you're establishing connections, it also looks a little different. I'll just draw this out for anybody who's curious. So when you first connect to somebody using TCP, the client, remember how we have a client and we have a server. The client says, hey, can you hear me? The server says, yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me? And the client says, yes, I can hear you. So you make sure that you have two-way communication between client and the server. However, when it comes to UDP, the client just says, hey, can you hear me? And then the server can either choose to ignore that, or it can choose to respond and say, yes, I hear you. And then, so as you can see, the interesting thing, I know I'm just kind of throwing a lot of information out there, but the interesting thing about TCP versus UDP is with TCP, you always know whether the computer you're trying to communicate with rejected you or whether it's not online. Because if it rejected you, it will respond to you and say, hey, you've been rejected. But with UDP, you don't know, because if it rejects you, it just won't respond. So a little bit of a interesting difference there. All right, so now I've bored you with all this nitty gritty stuff. Now we can go to the actual, what you came here for, what are the cybersecurity topics? So obviously cybersecurity arises from attackers doing bad things. So let's look at offense first. Offense is also oftentimes called red team. So when I say I like to do red team stuff, that means I like to do offensive stuff. And defense is often called blue team. Now, now that we're talking about colors, I guess I might as well talk about some other terms you might hear. Like there's a black hat hacker versus a white hat hacker. A white hat hacker is somebody who's a good guy who tries to break in on behalf of the company and tell them that there's something wrong with their security so that they can go in and change it. A black hat hacker is a bad guy who goes in maliciously and tries to break into a company. Now, there's also, some people like to use the term gray hat hackers for people who will try to break in somewhere and then they'll either tell the company that there's a problem with that, or they'll sell it illegally to somebody else who does malicious things with it. So they sometimes do it for good, but they sometimes do it for bad, kind of a gray hat hacker. You also might hear the terms like white box or black box. That's a little different. A black box is any kind of machine that you're trying to attack, but you have no information about it, or you don't know what's running on it. A white box is you're trying to get into it, but you already have access to it, so you can already see what vulnerabilities are on it. So that's just all the weird color terminology that a lot of people use. I don't know why, but there you have it. So in terms of penetration testing is what you would typically think of when you hear somebody say that they hack. It's looking for vulnerabilities in services that are running on a specific machine. Now, it has 4 stages. What I'm even going to do is I'm going to move this down so I have a little bit more room. Okay. The 4 stages are information gathering, vulnerability assessment or analysis, exploitation, and post-exploitation. Now, depending on who you ask, some people will say there are 5 stages and they'll call privilege escalation the stage between exploitation and post-exploitation, but it depends who you ask. So I'm not going to say that. And I'll talk about privilege escalation later anyway. So information gathering is like 75 or 80% of your time is spent doing this. It's just, there's 2 types of, there's passive information gathering and active information gathering. So before you go about actually breaking into somebody's machine, you have to learn about that machine. You have to know what sorts of services are running on it so that you can potentially find vulnerabilities that you can leverage, take advantage of. Passive information gathering is using things like Google or open source databases to gain information about an organization or specific machines, but without actually scanning them or without actively making connections to those machines. Active information gathering means you are actually making connections to the machine. And you would, so an example would be if you're doing a port scan, you're seeing what sort of service is running on which port in that machine, you would actually have to connect to it. The biggest tool probably for active information gathering that if you're in the cybersecurity world, you've heard of it, it's called Nmap. So Nmap is a collection of tools specifically for scanning. So once you've gathered enough information about the machine, as far as you can see from the outside, it's time to figure out what kinds of vulnerabilities are on the machine. So with your Nmap scans, let's say, you might find that it's running on so there's a service running on a specific port, and that service is an older service. And so you'll look up online, you'll look up that service and you'll see that, oh, it has a remote vulnerability, or remote code execution vulnerability, so it allows you to get into the server. So vulnerability analysis is taking what you've learned from information gathering and determining how you're going to access the device that you're targeting. Now, there are also some vulnerability analysis tools or that market themselves as vulnerability analysis tools like OpenVAS or Nessus or Nexpose. These are tools that do a lot of the info gathering and vulnerability assessment for you, and then let you know if what sorts of vulnerabilities they find. These are generally used more on if a company hires you to do a footprint of their network and tell them how insecure their network is. A lot of the times people use vulnerability scanners like these or vulnerability analysis tools like these. Attackers wouldn't usually do this because it's very obvious that you're performing a ridiculous amount of scans on your target. So malicious attackers will go more the Nmap route and look for specific vulnerabilities. But there are also tools like these that good people use just to quickly run scans on a machine and see if it has any vulnerabilities. All right, once you decide your way in, the next step is to get in. That's exploitation. And I'll talk about, maybe I'll do a little aside here now just to talk about what this looks like. So as an attacker, here's what I'm usually gonna do. I'm gonna do an Nmap scan to see what sorts of services are running on a computer that I'm trying to attack. Then, so there are some special cases that I'll talk about, like web attacks. That's kind of its own thing. So if it's hosting a website, I might look into web attacks, but otherwise I will look up services on some sort of exploit database like ExploitDB. It's a very common one. If you go on exploit-db.com, they have a list of a bunch of services and associated vulnerabilities. I'll find code. So ExploitDB is an open place where people can just throw in exploits that they have found. So somebody who knows a lot about a specific service will know that it's vulnerable to something like a buffer overflow. I won't explain what these are, but buffer overflow, string format exploit. There's a bunch of exploit, different kinds of exploits. And somebody who really knows the service well will work with the service and find one of these problems with it. And then what they'll do is they'll put code explaining this problem. They'll make it publicly available on a database like exploit-db. Now, why do they make it publicly available? Well, here's why. Usually when somebody finds a problem with a service, they'll go to the company, okay. Let me take a step back because I'm getting too excited and I'm gonna start from the beginning here. So a company hires you to look for vulnerabilities in a specific service that they offer. Now, they hire you to do it so that an attacker doesn't find it first. Now, as a good person, let's say you find a vulnerability like this. What are you gonna do? Well, you're gonna tell the company, you're gonna say, hey, I found this vulnerability. You need to fix it. But if you just tell them that they need to fix it, a lot of the times they'll get lazy and they won't actually do it because they'll figure you're the only one who knows about it, so it's fine. So then what people do is they threaten the companies and they say, if you don't fix it, we will make it publicly available in, like, let's say 2 weeks. So you have 2 weeks to fix it. And then after that, everybody will have access to it. So this better be fixed. So that's why a lot of the times, even not just malicious attackers, but good people who are hired by companies to tell them about problems will then make these exploits publicly available on databases. Now, as an attacker, I have access to this database. So I can use this database of exploits that other people created and use those to gain access to a computer, right? So a lot of the times this will be looking at code. So as an attacker, I'll be looking at code that I found in a database like this. I have to modify the code to do what I want it to do. So it might do something similar to what I want it to do, but I might have to change it depending on if I'm attacking a slightly different machine or a slightly maybe different version of Windows. Maybe I want a different kind of shell. So let's say maybe they wrote it for a bind shell, but I wanted a reverse shell instead. So I have to modify the code. And then I have to run the code. So there's a common misconception that hackers are programmers. It's like a yes and no. Hackers need to know how to program because they have to do a lot of modification of code. But in and of itself, usually they don't have to do any programming from scratch. Usually it's looking at other people's code and modifying it to suit your needs. So now that we have kind of that high level overview, this last step where we run the code, that's exploitation. So as soon as we run the code, get into the computer, that is known as exploitation. Now there are some, there's a very popular framework called Metasploit Framework. Whoops, I can't spell. That if you hear exploitation, a lot of the times you'll hear about this. So of course, databases like these, you can put vulnerabilities in them, but you can write it however you want in whatever language you want. So sometimes it'll be in C, sometimes it'll be in Java, sometimes it'll be a Python. The Metasploit framework is for very common vulnerabilities. People will write code for being able to leverage those vulnerabilities a lot more easily. So that's what the Metasploit framework is for. And those are specifically written in Ruby. And using the Metasploit framework, you no longer have to, because programmers or developers did the heavy lifting for you. You don't have to actually go into the code and look at the code itself, but there are some pre-configurable options for each attack. You set those options the way you like them, and you can perform exploitation that way. But that's only for very popular attacks that people do this. All right. So now once you make it into a person's computer, and what I should mention is the reason I talked about bind shells and reverse shells is because you use these. So like the buffer overflow or the string format, you use these to inject malicious code that will either create a bind shell or a reverse shell. So if you're trying to create a bind shell, you will leverage one of those vulnerabilities and inject code that opens up the target so that then you as an attacker can make a connection to it. Versus if you're using a reverse shell, you will inject code that will cause the target to attempt to connect back to you. I know this is all, if you haven't heard a lot of this before, I know it's all new, and I know it's all probably really confusing, but just trying to get your feet wet here once again. So your objective here is to have a shell, and for it to either be a bind shell or a reverse shell, right? And using these vulnerabilities that you've obtained from this database, you create either a bind shell or a reverse shell. All right, hopefully that's understandable. So once you've connected, and once you have this shell that you can input commands and get responses from your target, what can you do? Well, you can access any files that are on the machine. You can run any programs that you want on the machine. But there are some steps that a lot of people like to do to maybe gain access to other machines or to make sure that they keep access on the machine. So the first thing that you really want to do is establish persistence. Persistence means that you always keep access to the machine. So if somebody if somebody like turns off their computer and turns it back on, you can still have access to their computer. Or if somebody stops the service that you use to get into their computer, you can still have access to their computer. So this could be installing backdoors. So backdoors are files usually files. Files are services that are running on that target computer that allow you to connect to it, other than the way you initially connected to it. So if you connect to a computer, you install a backdoor. That means, oh, I have another way of getting into the computer in case I lose access one way, right? So there's persistence. Then so a lot of the times you got into one computer, but you want to keep going. You want to break into other computers on the network. That's known as lateral movement. Or pivoting. So you can attempt to break into other computers from the network through the computer that you've already broken into. So it looks like it's coming from that computer, but really you as the attacker are doing that, right? So there's that. There's pass the hash attacks. So passwords on your computer are stored in hashes as opposed to storing the plain text passwords. The reason for this is if an attacker gains access to your computer, you don't want them seeing all of your passwords, right? So instead, we're going to store a hash of the password. And that way an attacker can maybe get all the hashes, but they won't be able to figure out the original passwords. However, this still allows for certain types of attacks, pass the hash attacks, where instead of to log into a computer, instead of giving it the original password, you give it the hash and you use that to log into a computer. So let's say I break into one computer or I break into one device. I get all of the password hashes from that device. And then I know that the same user has an account on a different device. I can use the hashes that I got from one device to log in as that user on a different device. That's pass the hash attack. So a lot of times post-exploitation, you'll hear of something called hash dumping, which is where the attacker gets all those hashes so they can perform pass the hash attack. All right. I know I'm running low on time. I could talk about this for 5 hours, so I won't. I think some useful, because I talk about hashes, but I think it's useful to have an understanding of these three terms that a lot of people get confused on. Hashing, symmetric cryptography, or symmetric key cryptography, and then public key cryptography. And they all have their various uses. And if you have a good understanding of the differences between these, you'll have a leg up in a lot of your classes too, if you're taking CS or ECE classes. So hashing, all of these are ways of taking text and obfuscating it in some way or making it unreadable, except to those who you want to be able to read it. So hashing means you can take any text and convert it to what's called a hash. And this hash is ideally unique for each text that you have, but there's no way of converting a hash back to the original text. So it's a one-way thing. So the nice thing about this is to check passwords on a computer, right? You can take the password, you can convert it to a hash and see if it matches a hash that's stored on that computer. Now, an attacker who gains access to that computer, the original text isn't actually stored on the computer. Only that hash is stored on the computer. So the attacker can't gain access to the password because there's no way of converting that hash back to the original text. Symmetric key cryptography. You can convert plain text to ciphertext but you can also convert it back. So you can convert it back and forth. And ideally, this is used when you and the person you're trying to communicate with, when you both know the special key that you're going to use to encipher or decipher the text, that's where this comes in handy. So that anybody in the middle who's intercepting a message but doesn't know the key can't decrypt your message. Now, public key cryptography, the difficulty with symmetric key cryptography is, what if you want to establish a connection with somebody, but you don't have a shared symmetric key beforehand? That's where public key cryptography comes in handy. Each person will have their own private key and public key. Now you can take a message, so you can take text and you can encrypt it with one, and it can only be decrypted with the other. So the nice thing about this is if you share your public key, hence why it's called public, you share it with everybody, then you can encrypt messages with your private key, which only you have access to. And if somebody is able to decrypt it with the public key, they know that you must have sent it, because it can only be decrypted with the public key if it was encrypted with your private key. So that's useful for that. A lot of the times, public key cryptography will be used in conjunction with symmetric key cryptography, because encrypting with symmetric keys is much faster than encrypting with public and private keys. So you might exchange this symmetric key using public key cryptography, and then from there encrypt the actual files or whatever you want to transfer over with that symmetric key. Alrighty, so that's kind of an explanation for that. I am running really low on time. I kind of underestimated the amount of time I have. So I am going to breeze through a lot of this. That's okay. In addition to this whole process, there's kind of a separate section of attacks known as web attacks. So web attacks is through a web page, exploiting web page vulnerabilities. So some examples of web attacks are SQL injections, or file upload vulnerabilities, or file inclusion vulnerabilities, or file upload vulnerabilities. Okay, so a lot of the times usernames and passwords are stored in a database, and that database often uses, I want to say it's the structured query language, but I'm not entirely sure, SQL. But the problem is, the way that the code is written in a web page, for example, if you have a login page and you have a place for username and password, the way that the code is written, sometimes you'll be able to write SQL code in there and use that to perform functions that you're not supposed to be able to perform. So that's an SQL injection attack. File inclusion vulnerability attack is a lot of times web pages will end with something like this, where they'll have a file included in the URL. But if you can change that file to whatever you want, then you can essentially look at other files that are on the machine. Then a file, or you could even run files from your machine. File upload vulnerability is if you're allowed to upload files, but instead of uploading a file that you're supposed to upload, like a picture, you upload an executable file, and then you use that to gain access to a machine. So web attacks, kind of their own thing. There are also router attacks that are also kind of their own thing. Like if you've ever heard, there are 3 types of authentication when it comes to routers. There's WEP, there's WPA and WPA2. WEP is notoriously vulnerable, and even though it's outdated at this point, but a lot of people still use it, and you can just break into it very easily, just following a tutorial online. Any sort of script kiddie can do that. WPA and WPA2, much more difficult to get into. but you can still like, you can still grab the hash for that, and you can still try brute force methods like that. That's another term you'll hear a lot, brute force. And that's also a very common web attack. So brute force is when, let's say there's a username and password that you need to use to gain access to something. Let's try a bunch of different password combinations and see what works. That's what brute forcing is. And within that, there's dictionary attacks. And there's just straight brute forcing. So a dictionary attack is, let's say you have a dictionary of possible passwords that it could be, and you're just trying all those passwords. So a very common thing is people will just leave, when they set up a website, they'll leave portions of the website with login pages that they didn't even know about, let's say, with default administrator passwords. And then if you have a dictionary or a list of standard administrator passwords, you could just try all those passwords and gain access to the web page. There's also straight brute force, which is you use every single possible character combination until you can finally get in. So there's that sort of stuff. That kind of, I feel like that sums it up for penetration testing and these two. So how do we prevent those? I'm going to talk about that really quickly. So prevention, hardening means making the machine more difficult to break into. So this is before an attacker would be breaking into a machine. So that could mean changing the default passwords, obviously. Implementing security measures, such as a firewall. That's one thing I didn't talk about in networking, but a firewall blocks access to certain incoming or outgoing connections based on a specific port, and things like that. Monitoring, so that's actively looking at what's happening on your computer so that when somebody does break in, you can kick them out or you can take preventative measures. So within that, there's intrusion detection systems and intrusion prevention systems. So intrusion detection systems, or IDS, you might have heard of like Snort or Suricata. They alert you when there's suspicious activity going on your computer. So whether that's somebody just logged in suspiciously, or whether there's weird stuff being generated in log files. And then there's IP intrusion prevention systems that also have predefined rules for corrective measures to take if somebody goes in, breaks into your computer. There's also, you might have heard of a SIM, or security information and event management. I don't know, I'm kind of guessing, but I think it's something like that. That's pretty much a more advanced intrusion prevention system that gives you more options for like monitoring what's happening on your computer, visualizing it in a nice way, setting up procedures for what to do in case somebody breaks in. So that's in terms of monitoring. I'm actually not even going to talk about social engineering in this presentation because I already talked about it during the project day, if you were there for it. If not, at least part of that should be video recorded and on our website. But essentially, antivirus is kind of the third defensive thing that specifically prevents malware. And malware is often used in tandem with social engineering. So that is, I have tried to keep this at an hour. I could keep going for a very, very long time, but it is 1:45. If there's anything in particular that you're interested in, feel free to reach out whenever. If there's anything that you were confused about, but you want to learn more about, also feel free to reach out. I can send you resources on any of these things. I'll briefly mention what social engineering is though, so that I at least talk about it. Social engineering is tricking people or tricking the users of computers. So whether that is using a malicious USB, and if somebody plugs it in, you gain access to their computer, whether that's spoofing your email. So saying that an email came from a source that it didn't really actually come from. That's another common term you'll hear, spoofing and sniffing. So sniffing is listening in on connections between computers to gain interesting information. Like if there's a password exchange, you can sniff in and see what sort of information is being exchanged, maybe get the password. Spoofing is pretending to be somebody who you are not. So you can send an email as anyone. That's spoofing, and that would be a social engineering attack. There's also, you can pretend to be a different computer on the network. So there's man-in-the-middle attacks that you can basically put yourself in the middle of network communications between multiple computers. So that's all under the social engineering category. Last thing I want to mention, I know I mentioned this during the project date, but I'm going to mention it one more time now, just to really stress it. Depending on what you're interested in, we have stuff for you here at CyberHawks. If you're interested in penetration testing, which is specifically targeting the service vulnerabilities, attend our seminars. This is where our seminars will be going over this sort of stuff. Now, if you're interested in social engineering or tricking people or sending fake emails or fake file downloads, stuff, or malicious file downloads, stuff like that, join the malware development and social engineering project that's happening. If you're interested in blue team defense, specifically hardening and monitoring, that's where you would join the CyberForce competition. That's the competition we'll be having in the fall. And you'll be basically defending a network in real time and hardening it beforehand. So I just went over a lot of stuff, and I know I didn't connect it all because I really just started and there's a lot of stuff I can go over, but hopefully this gives you a sort of overview of what's out there, and it gets your feet wet in some networking concepts that you'll need to know when you start getting into cybersecurity, and some of the and some terminology that hopefully will be useful to you. So that's it. I will finish for now. Feel free to reach out to me whenever on Discord. If you have any questions, once again, my name is John Ford. I do red team stuff, and I'll end it there for here, or I'll end it here for now. There you go.
All righty. Thank you so much for pulling that together for us today, John. Excellent work as always. So for CyberHawks upcoming meetings, tomorrow night we'll be doing the first CyberForce practice session. So as John said, if you're interested in cyber defense stuff, please join that, and that'll be at 7:30 tomorrow night. We're looking at right now having an alternate time slot during the lunch hour on Fridays from 12:45 p.m. to 1:45 p.m. So I'll release more information on that on the Discord server when we settle that information. Next week we'll do we have a Ranger guest speaker coming in on the 15th. So please stop by at that if you're interested in learning about what it's like to be a network security or data information security manager at a company. We'll have one of their managers on hand to answer some questions on that and give us a short presentation on some current cybersecurity trends. And then the next cybersecurity seminar series. So today it was a different format than what we're kind of expecting to do for the rest of the semester. We'll start to do some more Try Hack Me stuff at the next one, and that one is going to be Tuesday, September 21st. So we look forward to seeing everybody at all of those. And that'll be it for today. Feel free to stick around and ask any questions if you have anything for either John or myself regarding today's presentation or any of the upcoming events and activities that we've got going on. Thanks, guys.